So by the year 64 AD, 63, 64, 65, in those years, Rome is under the control of Nero, who is slightly crazy and is in a moment of total chaos inside of Rome and experiencing the terrible fire of 64. And so Nero blames the Christians for setting Rome on fire. Why they would do that, nobody can say, but what he wants to do is, of course, usher in a massive crackdown on Christians, which is what he does. And in that crackdown, both Peter and Paul are executed. And then they are buried in two locations outside the city, Peter out at the far west side, Paul on the southeast side, in a location unmarked that the local congregations save in their memory, so that 300 years later, when it's legal to build a church, then both St. Peter's and St. Paul's are built on the locations of where Peter and Paul were buried. It was here back, in Augustus's time, and then the Christians later built this church over it because, of course, this became a very hallowed place because both Peter and Paul were imprisoned here. So that's a contemporary picture of Rome. It's still there. You can visit it. You can go into the prison. Here it is. There are two chambers, and this is where they would put prisoners. And in this one, there was just a big, huge hole, so they would just drop you through the hole, which suggested your future wasn't very good if you were going to be just dropped through the hole. I think probably once you ended up here, you were condemned to execution, and you weren't going to come out for any good reason. When they brought you out, that would be it. So they're both here, and it could be they were together. This is a marker on a wall of one of the catacombs, meaning people already, and this is inscribed into the wall, they were already connecting them together with Christ, with that Chi-Rho Greek symbol of Christ. So they're both in that prison for a period. Then they're both executed, and in the same way, they're taken out of the city, in this case the hill, the Vatican Hill, and on the other case, in the case of Paul, over to the south end. They're both taken out of the city, they're taken to this place, they're executed, and then the Christians bury Peter here and bury Paul there, but that's it. They just get buried. You can't have any kind of a little church or anything because you're an outlaw. You're bad, 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 bad. And so the community keeps the memory of where they're buried. And they will do this now for over 200 years. So at some point, probably they could put something here, but they can't build any church. There's, of course, what was built later on that spot, exactly that spot. Here's the dome that's right over the tomb. And down through the floor, you can look down, and here's the tomb of Peter, and there's Peter in there. And the archaeologists have done soundings on the bones of the person who is actually in the tomb, and it is first century male from the area where he's supposed to come from. And then Paul, it could have been, very close, within weeks, is taken to another site outside the city. You can see where it is in relation to everything else. There's the Vatican up there, and here's St. Paul outside the wall. So that's the church that's now on the spot. And here's the front of the church. And here's the interior of the church. The church, it's had a couple of fires, but it had a terrible fire in the 19th century. And so it had to be rebuilt. Now, it was rebuilt exactly the way it was before. But what you're looking at is the 19th century rebuild after the fire. But it didn't affect the underground tomb or anything like that. It was the roof. It was like the Notre Dame fire. It was exactly the same fire, burning up the roof. So the place of burial stayed the same, and it's the same story as with Peter. Community saves the name, saves the place, and then later probably put a marker, and then finally, here's the actual place, and now that they've done the archaeological work on it about 5 years ago, they've left it covered with glass, so you can actually look down and see under the altar. And here's Pope Benedict, who is there at the time of the archaeological work. And then here's the article that comes out showing that the test of the bones in the tomb are very likely Peter, because it's the date that they expect, and it's also someone from that place. The the place of origin both for Paul and Luke, because it's that border area between Turkey and Syria, has a certain genetic marker that's very distinct. Nobody else in the world has this particular origin. So here is St. Paul. It's worth a visit. Not only is the visibility of the under the altar fun to see, but there's a beautiful cloister outside, and that was not burned down. So the cloister is, 1,500 years old, the circular loggia outside. So there it is. So the same thing was done at both Peter and Paul, St. Peter's and St. Paul, both of them. And this solved one of the big issues that been around for years and years and years, and previous popes didn't want to allow it, and so now it's been done. Christians in Rome, we've talked about, and we know it was a complete accident that these two important leaders both ended up in Rome at this time, and both executed, and both created a kind of following. Their martyrdom made them, very, very famous and beloved, and so it's really almost an accident that the whole Christian group moves to Rome in the successive years after the death of Peter and Paul, and Rome becomes the center of Christianity, where, of course, it's really, it's a Jerusalem story. That's where it starts. It's Jews in Jerusalem. But two things happen simultaneous. One is Peter and Paul go to Rome along with a lot of other Christians. You see Luke was there too, Mark was there, could have been other people. At the very moment that the Roman Empire decides to crack down on Israel and their rebellious people, Israel was considered the most difficult province in the whole Roman Empire because those Jews were so impossible. And so they decided finally by the 60s they were going to crack down. There was a Jewish rebellion. And so in 70, part of the Roman army conquest of Jerusalem involves accidentally burning down the temple that had been there for 1,000 years, and it was back to Solomon's temple. This was all burned down, and the Jews basically were dispersed out of Jerusalem in the crackdown. The rabbis left because it was terrible. You didn't want to be there. And they went to other cities and emigrated. So at the very same moment that Peter, Paul, Luke go to Rome and begin to create this little nucleus, Israel and Jerusalem is wrecked. And it will be till 1947 that they're back, that they have a state. That's how long the exile lasts. So at the very same moment those two things happen, and the result is Rome becomes the center of Christianity. And in the next several hundred years, it will be Rome that again and again and again gives leadership to places like Christians in Britain and Christians in Ireland and Christians in Germany and Christians in Spain. All those places will get linked to Rome, so that by 800, the time of Charlemagne, there's no question. The Pope is in Rome, the Pope is in St. Peter's Church, and church is there on the spot, and that's the way things go. Randy's asking about citizenship in Rome, and so here would be Peter and Paul. Now, we don't know what Peter's status is. He could have been a non-citizen, but free until the crackdown, traveling, and could have been attracted because he knew Paul and he came to join him. But yeah, in the city at this point, we know at the high point it's 1 million people. And we're pretty much approaching the high point chronologically. So it would be a city of many hundreds of thousands, very international, huge presence of, non-Italians, and huge presence of Greeks, huge presence of Carthaginians and other cultures that were close by. And so a very open city. Yes, a huge percentage would not be citizens. The citizens would be the minority. That would be, written in their name, their lineage, their neighborhood, all those sorts of things, which gave them the right to vote as long as voting was still going on. It was going on. It's still going on. It's going to be later that any real tyrannical emperor finally just closed down voting. So what percentage? Out of the million, in terms of the city of Rome, you can guess that 25% are slaves. So you take out 25% of the population, and they're not slaves, so that's at least 250,000. Children, of course, underage, so that could be half. It'd certainly be another third, so you might have 2/3 now leaving a third of that population adult males and females. And of course, half of them are females, so they're not going to vote. The males are going to vote. So you're down to a couple 100,000 who would actually be voting citizens. So all of this brings us back to Luke and to his presence in Rome with Paul, 64, 65. And Paul says in his letter to Timothy, Luke is with me, so we know Luke was there. Here are the books that we just talked about. And then everything changes in 313, because in 313, Constantine decides to make Christianity legal. And when that happens, these Christians can come and build churches. So, for example, this one, St. Ambrose, Sant'Ambrogio in Milan. So about 325 and 350, so in the very first generation after the legalization, these churches go up. So all over, almost all right in Italy. Rome, a number of them. St. Peter's, St. Paul's, most likely the first version, built in 350 or so. In these new churches now, there would be preaching and the new ideas that were now becoming popular and helped explain why it spread. And this is one of them. The idea of what exactly this new life was. Overwhelmingly, people said they joined the group because of the way the people lived. And so this is what they were talking about, the idea of what was a good Christian life. For Aristotle, the greatest virtues were prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. In other words, stay in the middle, stay balanced, stay cool, orderly, rational. Whereas in this new preaching, the things that mattered were doing good things, specifically being active all over, everywhere, all day, everywhere you went. And one of the things is the individualism. Professor McGinn at University of Chicago talks about that, the individual, and how Christianity discovered the individual, which is a key to the Western tradition. Here's his quote. This is a crucial contribution to Western civilization because the individual from the absolute, it relieves the individual absolute restraints of family, society, neighborhood, all the different things that might hold you down, and you also are encouraged to pray directly to God, meaning, the individual connection. So that's the whole idea. And these are the things that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are going to write about in their books, and then, of course, Paul's letters. Paul's letters are the most important evangelization act, are the writing of the letters, because they come to all these cities, and people read them, they read them out loud, and they're still reading them. When you think about it, it's just fascinating that they were starting to read these letters in the year 50 AD, letters to the Corinthians, letters here, and now they've been reading them for almost 2,000 years, close to.